There were other of us who fought and fell behind the black banner during the civil rights era, not as Maddox tells us, I think very importantly here, Attorney Maddox, not so much for civil rights as for consumer rights. And it becomes sort of interesting that the civil rights struggle centered around lunch counters and retail stores. And you begin to realize that while this certainly was not the whole of civil rights, that there was an aspect having to do with consumption. The right to take our money and give it to people who hated our guts. And we see this still going on today. And again, we talk about this in on black violence. People don't want to live next to you, hate the sight of you, miseducate the children, want to continue their oppression. And then what do? Beat each other up so that we can carry our money to them, buy the bus loads, and feel proud of ourselves and feel good after we've given it to them. And then we'll say, why are you doing that? It's my right as a United States citizen. I'm telling you, you look at it very closely and you will see to a great extent many of the rights that we claim we have were really set up in a way so that the white community could get greater access to black resources and money. And watch, as we became desegregated, we engage in the wholesale disinvestment of the black community. And to a great extent, it was a result of getting caught up in these consumer rights, which is another game, by the way, to buy what I want, when I want it, as an expression of freedom. Watch that concept. I was talking to one man here in Chicago who was complaining about his daughter being mistreated by his white neighbors, he being the only black one in the neighborhood. What can I do about that? That's right. Oh no, but it's my right to live where I want to live. And you know, this is the expression of my right. And it's interesting that when we get through defining our rights, it almost always means carrying our money to white folk and giving our resources to white folk. But the ultimate thing that it means is that white oppression did not end there, did it? His right to buy into a neighborhood made his oppression even more clear. He brought his children into even more naked oppression by the very rights that he thought he had won and that he thought he was exercising. And to a great extent, the black community had run into that impasse. After getting all the fair housing laws and all of the lunch counter laws and the desegregation laws and the other laws passed, we were fit to be free at last. And yet we look up, and where are we? Suffering, still talking about what? The miseducation of our children, still talking about criminality in our communities, still talking about disease running rampant, still talking about poverty and unemployment. It was, as the French says, the more things change, the more they what? Remain the same. We begin to realize then that this freedom of consumption was not liberation. Quickly here, quoting Michael Parenti, businessmen collectively constitute the most class-conscious group in American society. As a class, they are more highly organized, more easily mobilized, have more facilities for communication, are more like-minded, and are more accustomed to stand together in defense of their privileges than any other group. And yet this is the group that depends on the consumption of our people. The ruling class is different from the subordinate classes, not only in terms of possessing more wealth. So we like to think that rich people are rich only because they have more money. Watch that. And more power and more prestige. But more importantly, in terms of their ownership of the means of production and their concern with production and their desire to conserve, expand, and increase these factors. The rich own the means of production and concern themselves with maintaining that ownership and expanding that ownership and controlling that ownership. This is a very important difference between rich and poor. It's just not more money and less money. This ownership and these concerns on the part of the ruling group induces in them a class consciousness, a group solidarity and action orientation, markedly different from their lower class counterparts. Under capitalism, ruling class power and wealth is to a very significant degree founded on the consumerism of the subordinate classes, and consequently the subordinate classes must be socialized into consumerism, not socialized into production, but socialized into what? Consumption. The consumerism of our people then, as stated by Parenti, the socialization of people into consumerism served to retard class consciousness. By consumerism, I'm quoting Parenti here, I am referring to the tendency to treat consumption, the consumption and accumulation of goods and services as a central purpose of life. And consumption is no longer just a means to life, but a meaning for life itself. And we can see this in the statistics of black people. This endless comparison of black income with white income. What percentage of black people earning of white income? As if that is the most important index of black freedom. Not what percentage of America do black people own. What percentage of the means of production do black people own? What kind of military and other kind of power do black people own compared to white folk? No, that's not even dealt with. What income do you have compared with white folk? And as I've told you before, there's a difference between income and wealth. Because you may make $100,000 or $200,000 a year, does not mean that you're equally as wealthy as another person who may have an income of $100,000 or $200,000 because they own $10 million worth of property. The person is worth $10 million. You are worth your monthly salary. Why do not we then compare wealth and the ownership of real estate? Why do we merely compare what? Income, which to a good extent is an index of consumption, not an index of ownership, not an index of power, not an index of control. And yet we are given these statistics over and over again. And therefore we have a consciousness of people who concentrate on income instead of wealth, consumption instead of production. And then you want to think because you got a salary equal to white folk that you're equal as wealthy. You got another thought comment. Consumerism is more than an attitude arising from personal greed. It is a mode of social behavior functional to capitalistic society. The corporate need is to produce more, to sell more, to profit more, to produce more, and so on endlessly. Under capitalism, the acquisitive impulse is not merely indulged, it is constantly instigated and developed into a life imperative that cannot easily be put to rest. A psychology of moreness, knowing no end. In other words, once you get into this consumption mode, it's hard to get out of it. How many of you fighting your children about these Christmas gifts? And they've been pounded through the year, and now at this point, with all kinds of advertising. And this is another difference I have to talk about. When I was growing up, you got what parents bought you. And the commercial market was pretty much projected toward adults. But now you have a commercial market that is highly segmented, that advertises not to adults only, but that advertises to specific segments in the society, all the way from older people. What do they spend? What are their habits? So you set this ad up this way if you want to get them. The mid-range, mid-age group, the adolescent, young adult group. What kind of music do they listen to? What kind of language do they use? What kind of taste do they have? So we want to set the ad up so that we can talk directly to them. But it doesn't stop only at adolescence. It talks about what? Children. Well, children from 4 to 5 or 5 to 10 are a $3 billion market. They are a market even though they're not working. They're not earning money, but they are a market because they know that these little kids can worry mom and daddy to death. And mom and daddy are going to do what? Buy those gifts. And therefore the little ads are directly shot, directly at them. They internalize them and express them in their attitudes and behavior toward their parents. And their parents are influenced by it, and the money goes out. And it's hard, once you get into it, to stop it. This is what we talk about. It becomes what? Imperative. You can't cut it off. It's like trying to cut off a smoking habit or something. Thus, the attention and energies of people in capitalist society becomes decidedly privatized. Consequently, while the socialization of the owning class members is designed to foster class loyalties and cohesions, the socialization of the propertyless move with opposite effect. And we can see it going in opposite direction. Thus, the development of the working class consciousness is retarded because all of them are caught up in their individual consumption and concern. And yet we're talking about businessmen, businesswomen, the corporate, group, the business establishment, but we hesitate to talk about groups of others on the lower level. Once again, we see that power is used not only to pursue interest, but to define interest, which is another power that the wealthy and the rich and the owners of production have that the consumer does not have. To define interest. Again, in Black on Black Violence, I talk about there in chapter 8, desiring production, of how tastes are created by the system. And how, in a sense, those things that we own as black people are devalued by the system. And only those things that have value are things owned by the other people. And their advertising establishment and their media creates a taste for everything that you don't have and that you can't make for yourself. That's the only way it can work. How did you gain the taste for what you have today? We enrich our oppressors, increase their wealth, increase their power, and we create and maintain within ourselves a consciousness that maintains our oppression. We are so caught up in the consciousness of consumerism that we commit violence against one another in order to engage in consumer behavior. We sell poison to our children. We corrupt our communities. We disinvest the wealth of our communities. And we think that this is an expression of freedom, and this is an expression of wealth and status. And this means that since we consume equally to white folk, since we drive the same cars as white folk, live in the same houses, the same neighborhood as white folk, we are the same as white folks. You are foolish. It is that very sameness that is maintaining the inequality. I was trying to explain to my class the other evening the confusion people have of equating sameness with equality.